Welcome to another edition of Geopolitics and Empire. Quick reminder, support the transmission. You can do that by becoming a paid subscriber on the Substack, a little over $9 a month. We do private weekly Zoom chats with members only to shoot the breeze and current events. I also do a weekly write-up of the news with my own analysis and a collection of all the best news headlines. And we bring back past podcast guests sometimes to do a live Q&A with supporters only. You can donate. All the links are on the website, geopoliticsandempire.com. You can purchase a consult if you want to chat with me about expatriation, geopolitics, or whatever you like. Do check out all of my affiliates and sponsors. That helps me. And leave a podcast review if you haven't already. Returning to the broadcast is retired British ambassador to Syria, among other posts. He's also involved with George Galloway's Workers' Party, Peter Ford. Welcome back to Geopolitics and Empire, Peter.
I'm delighted to be back with you. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, I follow your work. I very much enjoy your analysis and commentary. We last spoke, I think, something like 6 years ago. I was in Kazakhstan at the time. I'm back in Mexico now, and we discussed Syria. You called it an imperial war on Syria and the world, and it appears, Damascus has fallen. And I want to get your sort of download on that. Just to start, how is it that Syria fell under Assad, who was purportedly backed by Russia?
Well, one word, sanctions. Sanctions were horrendous. Syria suffered the worst sanctions regime that any country on the planet had suffered, at the hands mainly of the US, also the EU and UK. And cumulatively, after more than a decade of being heavily sanctioned, this caused collapse. First of all, collapse of the economy, and in consequence, collapse of morale of the people, morale of the army. Sanctions worked exactly as they were designed to work, to cause discontent, and this is what happened. The people, not very aware of the geopolitics of what was going on, blamed Assad for the fact that they had no electricity or no more than a couple of hours a day. They couldn't import anything because Syria was blocked from using the dollar and therefore excluded from the world trading system. Syria couldn't do anything. And on top of that, Syria was not able to use its own oil resources because those were being controlled effectively, again, by the US through the 2,000 US troops sitting there in the eastern oil-bearing regions and controlling the access to the oil, mainly through their Kurdish militia surrogates. So a country that can't access its own major resource, export resource, which was accounting before the Arab Spring for 20% of GDP. Syria was blocked from having access to its own major resource, oil and grain. That area was the Kansas of the Middle East, up there in the northeast. And then the sanctions and being excluded from the world trading system. This is what was designed. This is what the empire decided a long time ago, and had the patience and the determination to wait for the fruit to fall. And fall it did. I mean, the collapse was a bit like the collapse of a bridge. It's okay until one day it's not okay. The precise circumstances of the collapse are not that important. It was the cumulative effect of the sanctions, the isolation of Syria, being deprived even of its own resources. So the army was nowhere near combat ready, either in terms of equipment or morale. The army had to release many of its combat soldiers to allow them to go back and help their families who were struggling economically. So numbers were depleted. And meanwhile, up in Idlib in Jihadistan, they were enjoying energy, electricity, support coming in from so-called humanitarians. They were the only part of Syria to benefit from all this humanitarian manna that the Western NGOs were pouring into Syria. But more importantly, they were receiving massive help from Turkey, economic, military, political, mentoring. They were receiving intelligence support from the UK, particularly help with communications and waging the war in the information battle space, which proved to be very important, and where Syria itself barely even engaged. They were still in the manual age, while the jihadis were in the digital age. And then, of course, you had massive help, financial help from the Gulf, particularly from Qatar, a country with bottomless pockets. So the jihadis had their little army there, which in the end barely had to fight. Didn't have to fight. It was like a knife going through butter. The Syrian soldiers, often unpaid, unmotivated, demoralized, just gave way, and that's how it happened.
And just to go further then on the why the agenda, as you mentioned Turkey already. From what I can reckon, it was U.S., UK, Israel, Turkey who done it, and to get your further thoughts, sort of how and why. This wider war, this wider great game. It seems to be, there's this greater Israel project, there's a greater Turkey project, right? Erdogan seems to be wanting a neo-Ottoman empire. There's the spoils, as you mentioned, in the north, the oil, again, land for Israel, land for Turkey, future energy pipelines. Just your further thoughts on what were some of the central whys, agendas here and interests.
Yes, to be honest, I don't really attach much importance to that. It was a lot more basic. The empire, the US empire, could not tolerate to have a less independent Arab state standing. Syria was the last man standing. The US had all the other bases, every other Arab country and territory covered, with a partial exception for little Yemen that everybody had forgotten about until recently. But basically, Syria was the last man standing from the wave of Arab nationalism. And the only state which was supporting actively the Palestinians. All the others were taking orders from Washington effectively. And so this is as simple as that. Syria had to be knocked out. And we're seeing now that the new regime is trying to sell itself as not interested in Palestine. And the US empire is now cozying up to a new, or allowing itself to be cozied up to by a new client in the area, which will take orders from Washington and Tel Aviv.
Just on that last note of Syria having been the last man standing, I had another something I've been thinking about, this idea of a new Middle East. I'm reading the Globalist White Papers, Council on Foreign Relations, Foreign Affairs. They recently published a piece which talked about a new Israeli order in the Middle East, and for over a decade, they have been consistently discussing a new Middle East and the creation of an EU and NATO-like Middle Eastern sort of regionally integrated structures. And as you mentioned, it seems the Gulf countries are on board with a lot of this. Just any further thought on this this idea of trying to get everyone in the Middle East sort of consolidated?
Well, there's no doubt that a major realignment of the stars is underway. The diplomatic firmament now is a new kaleidoscope, and Israel is by far the most powerful actor now in the region. It's demonstrated that over the last 2 years. Many of us, sympathetic to Palestine, thought that Israel could not stand for very long a war on more than one front. But we were mistaken. We were thinking about the 60s and the 70s, when it was true that Israel could not bear a long war with Egypt and Syria and other Arab states at the same time. But in more recent times, Israel only has to stand up to a couple of ragtag armies of guerrillas and militias, Hezbollah and Hamas. It's proven that it's well capable of standing up against those militias for an extended period, and can brush off pinpricks from Yemen. It was less able to brush off attacks from Iran, but Iran came off worse, it seems. I mean, there's a bit of an information void on this subject. How effective were the Iranian strikes on Israel, and how effective were the Israeli strikes on Iran? But I think we would be wise to assume the worst and conclude that Iran came off worst and is now in a much weakened position. There are new priorities for the axis of resistance. The first is survival, for Iran to survive as an independent power, for Hezbollah to maintain its position of influence in Lebanon. And I fear mere survival is asking a lot for the Palestinian resistance. The other thing we've learned over the last 2 years is that there are no restraints whatsoever on Israel. In the past, we deluded ourselves into thinking that international law counted for something in the eyes of countries like Britain and America, which were constantly talking about the rules-based order, but we've had it thrown in our faces, and it's been demonstrated that Israel can act with total impunity, whatever it does. If it fed Palestinian children through a meat grinder, we'd say it's self-defense. There are no limits, and they're actually quite close to doing that. And it will need a miracle if they do not grind their way through Gaza, make of Gaza simply a new West Bank, where the Israelis move in and out and control large swathes of the territory. And it will need another miracle to ensure that the West Bank does not go the same way as Gaza and find itself, or the Palestinian areas, being obliterated, should they be so impertinent as to show any resistance to the creeping annexation of Palestinian lands by Israel. And now other options are off the table. The Palestinians can't be helped by Syria, can't be helped by Hezbollah, can't be helped by Iran, and international opinion counts for nothing. It's a very depressing state of affairs.
It was really something to see, the likes of Lindsey Graham come out a few months back and say, "Look, the ICC is not for America or for Israel. It's meant for our adversaries, Russia and African countries." And it's truly, I mean, the hypocrisy and double standards is. I'm just in awe of how they can sleep at night. These people. And you mentioned the axis of resistance. This was one of my questions. Right before all of this, there was this image in in media, alternative media, of the axis of resistance, BRICS, the multipolar world was on the rise, Russia, China, Iran, and it just seems, with Syria, that bubble was sort of popped. Russia stood down. I always go back to Dr. Francis Boyle, who's been a friend of the podcast, his book on destroying Libya and world order, where he said back over a decade ago, Russia had been too weak. They had to basically let Libya and Gaddafi go, throw them to the dogs because they couldn't do anything. And, we saw Russia over the past decade build up, get stronger, but it's almost like a repeat of the Libya scenario. What do you make of the future here when it comes to BRICS, multipolarity, the strength of Russia, Iran, China, and the rest?
Well, in a way, the opposition to the empire has been strengthened because there's been a demonstration that if they don't unite, and particularly if China doesn't stay close to Russia and Iran, they'll be next. This must be the lesson that other powers are taking from what's been happening over the last 2 years. That it's clear that the empire, there are no restraints now. They will move on. When they've dealt with the Middle East, they'll deal with China. Russia may get a pass. Trump may make an attempt to co-opt Russia into being against China. So there's a new imperative in the global South to pull together, to close ranks. And in the very long term, this may work against the interests of the empire. The global South is disgusted by what it's seen in Gaza, shocked by the blatant disregard for international law, shocked by the interference in the internal affairs of sovereign states, shocked by the regime change that we've seen, and maybe is already being galvanized into action. You're seeing more military cooperation between Russia and China, both those two, and Iran. And we see more countries joining the BRICS. We see emerging nations, important nations like Brazil, falling more squarely into line with Russia and China. For the long term, this is perhaps the equally important lesson to draw as the apparent success of the empire over the last year.
You mentioned Trump. I was going to ask you your thoughts on, he's coming in foreign policy under Trump, but World War III, do you think the threat, it's talked about all the time. Do you think it's dying down, this fear of World War III for now, or do you see, at some point, maybe once the empire goes for the gold, so to speak, after China and Russia, that could be a fear, or the thoughts there?
Well, I think the one to watch is growing tension between Europe and Trump's America. Trump seems to be going out of his way to make enemies in Europe. He's picked fights with the Prime Minister of UK, Keir Starmer. Now he's picking a fight today with Denmark, sending his son to plant the American flag on Greenland. I mean, he's really going out of his way to alienate Europe. It's almost like he was working towards the breakup of NATO. And of course, he's advertised an intention to do just that. In the past, it didn't come about last time round, but hey, it seems to me that this is the breakup of NATO is back on the agenda, demanding that the Europeans pay so much more for defense, take spending to 5% of GDP, is literally asking the impossible, as well as being impertinent. It's like he's setting up NATO for a fall and looking to quarrel with the Europeans to give him an excuse to pull the US out of NATO. And there are historical precedents. The US famously scuppered the League of Nations in the aftermath of World War I, withdrawing unilaterally from the international organization that existed before the United Nations. In more recent times, the US withdrew from one of the important agencies of the UN, UNESCO, over Israel. And there's a strong current, you will know better than me, of isolationism in the US, which Trump appeals to and encapsulates and will take forward, I think. So this is something to watch, and will have great bearing on how the empire behaves over the coming months and years. I'd just make one other observation about Trump's early days. I think many of his actions are calculated tactically to get his picks through congressional approval. Some of his positions, like his very, very pro-Israeli position, seems to me might be a bit tactical. And once he gets his congressional picks, people like Tulsi Gabbard into office, we may see a slightly different Trump, who doesn't have any international friends, not even Netanyahu. In fact, I believe he's not a big fan of Netanyahu. And I think he's also made some of his choices in order to get people out of Washington or set them up for a fall, like choosing little Mario to be secretary. I think he may well be setting little Mario up for a fall. So Trump is unpredictable. And I'm not optimistic that he'll go the right way on the Middle East, but he does seem to have a genuine intention to wind up the European war that we haven't mentioned so far, but which is really the most important thing in world geopolitics right now. It does seem that Trump, one way or another, will help to engineer the end of that conflict. And I mentioned earlier, maybe he'll be trying to wean Russia away from its close support for China. And maybe Russia would be receptive to that. That's something else to watch out for. But there's a long way to go. It's actually quite difficult to see how the Ukraine conflict can be wound down. You have the immovable object and the irresistible force. But there may have to be more of a Ukrainian military collapse before the end will be in sight.
And what you mentioned about NATO, I've entertained different scenarios. Although I see it's attempting to expand. I feel it's a core node of the global empire. They want an Asian NATO now, literally to incorporate Asian countries into NATO. They've even posited Mexico joining NATO and Latin American countries. But I could see, as you say, the EU collapsing. But my fear, it's happened in the past. You mentioned League of Nations, so on and so forth. But my fear would be that they would have taken the lessons from NATO and EU, and they would build back better with new, bigger supranational institutions. And you just got a couple of questions left. Again, your thoughts on the future of Syria, these people who are in control now. Will Syria will it remain in poverty? Will it, or will this new sort of government be able to have sanctions removed? Will it become a Sharia-like state? And will the Christians in Syria be doomed? I've been hearing about Christians being attacked now.
Yeah. Well, I think that the likeliest thing that can happen is that Syria will recover, will get a life again, will get electricity, will get food, but lose its soul, will lose its conscience, will no longer be Arab. It'll be interesting to see what the new name of Syria is going to be. Currently, it's the Syrian Arab Republic. I think maybe that may get dumped and it will become the Islamic Republic of Syria. I think it is possible to foresee quite a good economic outcome for the people of Syria. Maybe the US will allow the new Syria to have access to its own oil. Maybe they'll dump the Kurds. I think this is on the cards, and they're just arguing about the terms of the Kurdish surrender. And the sanctions will be lifted, or already it seems that a partial lifting of sanctions is going ahead. And Syria will start to trade with the world, and tourists will come back. So, yeah, I think Syria could become more like Lebanon, irrelevant actually as a state, and it will become a client of the empire. Against that, there is one big fly in the ointment: Israel. Israel doesn't want Syria to get a life. Israel doesn't take yes for an answer. It's not enough for the jihadi leader of Syria to keep telling the world, no, really, we're not against them. Israel, we don't care what they do. We have no time for the Palestinians. That yes is not an answer. Groveling doesn't help with Israel. So Israel, you can see this is happening through the think tanks that they control in Washington, which are arguing against sanctions lifting. I think there's actually something of a mighty battle going on in behind the scenes right now in Washington, a fight between the deep state, which wants to make Syria a full client of the empire, and therefore needs to cut the new Syria some economic slack, and the Israel lobby. It's like King Kong against Godzilla. Israel being Godzilla, and usually Israel wins these fights, but I'm not sure it will manage this time. Of course, the Trump administration just over the horizon. They may tilt the board in the Israeli direction and try to keep Syria in the abysmal state in which it lies at the moment.
Oh, and what of Assad? Do you think he'll just finish the remainder of his days quietly in Russia? I think I read that he's going to go back to his previous practice what was he, a dentist or ophthalmologist? I can't recall. Or I fear he might end up dead. As the empire likes often, dead men tell no tales. And there were these rumors. I don't that his wife was going to divorce him. The Kremlin denied that. Any thoughts on Assad?
None of it matters because Assad is yesterday's man. He has no future in Syria. He has no following. And there's a sense, even among his former supporters, that he abandoned them. So we don't even need to talk about Assad. He's for the showbiz pages now. Not the political news. But within Syria, there is an opposition. There is an armed opposition still. The Alawites, who face the same fate as the Yazidis did at the hands of ISIS, are fighting back to some extent. In the south, some of the Druze are not happy about the way the new rulers are comporting themselves. And we mentioned the Kurds earlier, who are fighting up there in the northeast. And there are several unruly militias, which HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Shams, the main group, is having difficulty corralling and controlling. And in fact, HTS seem to be very thinly spread. Just a month ago, they barely had enough troops to fill Idlib. And now they're trying to control an entire country. They're spread very thin. So it's not that difficult for local militias to pop up and resist them. And they will be wise to leave communities alone. But there's a big problem over possession of weapons. The jihadis are entering villages, trying to take people's guns away, and that just provokes resistance. So it's not quite all over in terms of fighting in Syria. But at the end of the day, it's highly likely that the new Al-Qaeda state will take full control. And that is what it is. Let's not beat around the bush. This is Al-Qaeda-stan. Syria is now an Al-Qaeda-run state. It has a leader with a founding member of ISIS and a founding member of Al-Qaeda in Syria. That he wears a Brooks Brothers suit and is pursuing a charm offensive doesn't change the reality that America is now allowing an Al-Qaeda state to emerge. And it makes you wonder, well, what was the war on terrorism all about? And who actually won? If you judge by results, Al-Qaeda won, because now they control the state.
My last question for you is more for us in the West here on media and propaganda. This podcast has been a target of the security state, the Department of Homeland Security, NATO, I believe. Speaking of NATO, I forgot to mention, I got a message the other day from the organization No to NATO, and I saw you were, I think, recently were a guest on No to NATO. I'm, as a European Croatian citizen, I'm definitely not a fan of NATO, and you were on the recent media panel with Piers Robinson and Professor David Miller for the UK column. And it was funny, Piers showed a screen grab of a hit piece the Times did on him, I believe in 2020, I think, spring of 2020. And that screen grab was actually a screen grab of his appearance on my podcast. So thanks to my podcast, I got Piers into trouble, among other guests. But how do you assess the current state of the nexus between our governments in the West, their military intelligence apparatus, the mainstream media, and big tech, followed ultimately by this increase in censorship that we're seeing, which includes basically thought crime? People are now being deplatformed, debanked, even fined and jailed for wrong thought. Just your sort of thought on the media censorship sphere, particularly in the West.
Well, the fight back is underway. You're already seeing it in the United States, where people like Zuckerberg are now changing their tune. I think breaking news today, the fact checkers are being made redundant. Here in this country, there's blowback from what you would loosely call the right. The main opposition parties are onto this, making a cause of it. For several years, there was no pushback, but that has changed just in the last 6 months or so, driven by the success of Trump, and some of those clouds have blown over the Atlantic, and there is now a stronger libertarian movement, which includes my own party, the Workers' Party of Britain, which is unusual on a party that used to say it was of the left, but we've stopped even saying that we are of the left now. We're socialist. But we don't buy that the left is socialist anymore. Our ruling Labour Party here is more to the right than many previous conservative governments have been, and certainly even more Atlanticist and more of a warmonger. So there are new alliances springing up. We even have points in common with the dreaded Nigel Farage, the current leader, Pache Musk of the Reform Party, who is emerging as a real power in the land and is very likely to become, if not the prime minister, at least an important part of a coalition which may emerge the next time the people of this country get a chance to throw out the Labour government.
Well, it's going to be interesting times ahead, and this was a great, again, getting a download from you on the state of Syria and the world. Is there any final thought, as well as again, the best, if there's any place to find you, or the best projects, Workers' Party or whatnot?
Well, I value my sanity, so I don't do much social media. I'm not on X or anything like that. But my stuff is carried on the website of the Workers' Party of Britain. People have only to Google Workers' Party of Britain, and my stuff will generally pop up. But we're looking, as a party, we're looking to raise our profile. If there's a by-election in this country, I may be standing as a candidate for parliament. We live in hope.
All right, the link is in the description, so people can check that out. And again, thank you for speaking truth to power, Ambassador Ford, and for coming back on the podcast.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.